Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. This is Joe with the LSA, and I'd like to welcome all of you to our webinar series. Today's webinar is titled Top Questions We Hear from SMBs, and will be brought to you by our guest presenters Gary and Chris from Marquette Group. So with that, let's get started. Over to you, Gary.
Thanks, Joe. Appreciate it. With me is Chris Malone. As Joe mentioned, we're going to skip protocol and jump right in and move through this. You see our contact information here. We'll show this slide again at the end, but both Chris and I have been with Marquette Group for an extended period of time and have a great deal of history working with SMBs, and hopefully can bring some insight to the subject matter at hand today. So as you can see here, Marquette Group's been around for, in essence, a little over 52 years, and our real forte is delivering local leads to the SMBs. We honestly work directly with well over 1,000 SMBs, and we understand their mindset and challenge. The intent of this webinar is to go through a few of the questions, common questions that we hear, and the challenges that are represented with that, and hopefully bring some value to the subject matter. So without further ado, we're going to jump right into the first question. And believe it or not, probably the most frequent question we hear, and I'm sure most of you will believe that, is how do you get listed first on Google? Many of the SMBs that we work with are going to be represented in the real small side of that category. They're typically 10 employees or less, often single employee-entrepreneur relationships. But one of the reasons we feel that keeps happening and why the subject matter remains relevant today as it was 5 years ago, even 10 years ago, is the marketplace is still crowded with a lot of false promises, as you can see here, and I'm sure you guys have run into it. But these small businesses continue to think about how to position themselves, and everything seems to revolve around Google in their mindset. So take that one step further. There's also a scenario where, and previous slide represents that, there's a lot of promises out there that tend to be too good to be true. And these guys, with their limited depth of understanding of digital advertising and just advertising in general, they tend to fall for that to a certain degree. So often when we work with these SMBs, we're trying to neutralize bad experiences. These guys tend to still fall for or work with organizations that deliver big promises and an authoritative approach, even when logically it doesn't make sense, and those of us with a little experience recognize the fault or flaws within what's being represented. Many of these small businesses take advantage of these opportunities and then end up becoming dissatisfied with the digital marketing environment as a whole. Another challenge that goes hand in hand with this is differentiating SEM from SEO. And one of the lead questions that we often work through, and a classic struggle that we get in response, is one of the lead questions we ask when we're trying to pitch product to the SMBs is, do you have time to discuss a PPC campaign on Google? And often we get a response back, I don't need advertising, I'm already on Google, meaning they've got some kind of an organic representation. And often that organic representation is not very strong. Which leads us then to the fact that these SMBs really don't understand what the main influencers are. They're not really picking up on concepts and how to leverage digital advertising correctly, hence back to the question of how can I get positioned first on Google?
So I think just to wrap this section up, you know, our experience is that we are all swimming in waters of small business owners that have been very poorly educated. So, you know, the typical local salesperson is going back in talking about position versus objectives, or they're trying to explain a very complex market. And if we level with ourselves, the complexity that these small business owners had to deal with 2 or 3 years ago when traditional media was really the expanse of what they had to consider. If you consider Yellow Pages, the technical buying decision was, it's alphabetical and all the big ads are in the front. But I think that as digital marketers, our sales forces tend to go too far and try to get super technical with people who simply aren't equipped to think that way. So rather than thinking about how do you explain algorithms to them, or how do you help them understand precisely how display ads are being bought across a DSP, we simply need to focus back into making it very simple to help them understand how digital marketing supports basic marketing principles, and that we're doing a very good job of helping educate them against their objectives as opposed to talking about simple tactics that most salespeople are out there talking about today.
All right, so transition into the next question that we often hear is, where should I spend my marketing budget? And this subject allows us to bring in some recent information that was pulled together by LSA from their digital boot camp survey results. And you see here that really it's a very unfocused nature of how the SMBs are, or at least it appears to be unfocused, that they're spreading their money across multiple facets of advertising, as you see by the chart that's here. And what I find really interesting is that they claim that they're spending the largest percentage of their budgets on social media and search engine optimization. Our experience would suggest that that's not the case. I'm not discrediting LSA's information because that's what these guys are claiming, the SMBs are claiming. But in reality, I would find that really difficult to believe based on the type of things we see of what they're doing with social media and the limited exposure that they seem to have with SEO. In fact, many of them don't really grasp the concept of SEO at all. So while, again, it just seems to be a bit of a disjointed answer in our opinion. Taking one step further and looking at another LSA statistic that shows that 3 out of 4 SMBs would prefer to work with one supplier, but in reality 2 out of 4 are working with multiple providers. Our experience with this is very consistent with this statistic. In fact, more than one provider often, or multiple providers is in multiple numbers. We believe that that's being driven by a number of factors, including previously mentioned bad experience with some form of a digital vendor, multiple agencies or websites calling on these SMBs on a consistent basis. We've seen statistics that say perhaps these guys are getting contacted as much as 20 to 30 times a month with various sales opportunities or advertising opportunities online. Certainly a lack of ROI connectivity to the money that they spent. They don't understand whether they got their money or not, which allows them to, or directs them in their mind to turn to another alternative in which to look at digital advertising. All this creating the churn in the marketplace that we all fight through. So we have found, and the tendency of Marquette Group is to simplify this down and try to talk to the SMBs in their terms. SMBs think in terms of sales. How do we move their cash register? Not necessarily the advertising product. We often lead with a price point and a total dollar amount rather than trying to equate that back to common sense of building out an ROI model or a desired sales model, as you see illustrated here, trying to tie it back to what kind of results are they looking for, what's that going to take to drive them there from a dollar standpoint, and is that an ROI that they can live with? Again, trying to simplify this down to a commonality of approach that they can understand, relate to, and ultimately measure against. So when you go look at another LSA statistic, which is up on slide, more than half of the SMBs have a budget that tends to be on the lower end of the scale. At least in the environment we work in, I would say the industry verticals we work in, that's even more severe. Probably 75% of these guys have really small budgets that they're working with and have expectations that are somewhat misaligned with the budgets in which they come to the marketplace. This next statistic that's up on screen from boot camps, LSA boot camps, is showing that these SMBs want to grow significantly, but they're not investing dollars in relationship to that within the digital environment or within the advertising environment as a whole. There tends to be there's a tendency to think of digital advertising as ultra cheap and that it should produce magical results that in reality we all know don't happen.
So I think the biggest thing we're seeing with small businesses as it relates to the way that they're investing is, as it's always been, they make decisions very tactically. Typically, they don't sit down and do a planning session that helps them come up with a very congruent strategy that meets in line with their goals. They tend to buy from one of the 29 salespeople that call them over the course of the month and make a decision off of how they're going to invest based off of whoever has the best sales pitch. So at the end of the day, we find typically that customers have very disjointed strategies, but on the other end, they're also very much looking for someone who could be purely consultative, media agnostic, and help them build cross-channel strategies that really truly support their objectives. So I think there's just a tremendous amount of opportunity for everyone on the phone today if you can really help them understand how media works together. And it's really important, even if you don't offer a certain media type, if yours complements that you work in cooperation with other agencies or other products to really help meet the need. And that's where we're seeing tremendous growth as an agency today.
Moving on to the next typical question that we hear, why can't I see my ad when I search for it? We've all heard that multiple times. Again, leveraging a statistic that is coming out of LSA Boot Camp, you can see here that roughly 70% of the SMBs have limited or basic knowledge, beginner knowledge when it comes to digital advertising. They truly don't understand it. They're focused on running their business and they want to and need to learn more about digital advertising, but they struggle to find authoritative source. They struggle to find credible sources in which to learn and, quite frankly, time in which to invest in that learning. Which then drives to this next subject, the importance of an SMB education. We have had a great deal of success and find it positive to have a cohesive message that will help alleviate product and performance confusion while providing thought leadership and guidance. We've been doing this, and we know others within the industry have been doing this through training sessions, webinars, blogs, online resources. The more you educate the SMB, and certainly those in which we're working with, there's a residual effect that we have found extremely beneficial. Not only does it help satisfy the SMB and their need to understand how their money is being spent and what it's producing, it also brings back a higher rate of, well, just look at the statistics on the page. 11% of SMBs who placed an order and attended a webinar on average sorry, lost my train of thought. 11% of these spent on average 11% more than those that did not attend the webinar. Take that one step further, 36% of these folks that attended the webinar are showing a higher renewal rate than the non-attendees. So an organization like ours could argue that that takes a lot of time and effort to put these education sessions together, that it's a waste of time, but in reality, we're seeing a direct benefit from working with our clients, helping them understand the value of what is being brought to the table, and then ultimately allowing them to make a much more educated decision.
So, I just expand on that to say, the education of the customer now is more important than ever. We're obviously clearly more accountable than we've ever been, and that accountability is only growing. So when they see statistics that are coming up through reporting or performance data that comes up through reporting, and they're not able to actually go out and tangibly see where that ad's coming in from because they're looking at the typical high-dollar searches, I know areas that us as marketers typically would shy away from because we're looking for cost efficiency and greater conversion. It can be very confusing, and the way that we've combated that is really by implementing an ongoing education process. It's a process where not only do we set the expectation at the point of sale, but that process is repeated over and over and over almost every single time that we get on the call to go through results with the client. And really that's our answer to how do we reduce the significant attrition that many agencies in our space face. There have been Wall Street Journal articles about the churn of some of the big partners or agencies in the space that provide paid media campaigns to small businesses. And I truly don't believe it's a matter of they're not delivering performance. I believe it's just a matter of how well they connect with their customers to provide the education around where the performance is coming from.
So shifting into the next question and just following this thought pattern, yeah, but how many calls does this bring me? And it could be clicks, how many, whatever, store visits. But for our point of reference, we'll use calls. The advantage of a third party like ourselves or like many of you that are on the phone is that we can bring a sophistication and a tracking method to the table that allows these guys to access sophisticated dashboards, integrated data, call clicks, form submissions, etc. Start quantifying the results in a way that they typically have not seen in the past. You think through that, there's still a situation where you can provide them all the content and information as far as performance, but if they don't understand what that means, it has no real bearing and no real benefit to that SMB. One, they have to take the time to look at it, which is another challenge, but ultimately they have to understand what they're looking for and have the ability to measure it against what expectations were. So the desire for this ROI tracking ultimately drives back to what the SMB needs to know, which is where did the leads come from, determine how many new leads they were able to close, the average amount of commissions, fees, or however they get paid on these leads, basically how do they get paid on a successful sale, and ultimately what does that mean to them from an ROI standpoint. This is perhaps one of the most difficult things to work through because of their lack of understanding of connecting that last mile, if you will, from the time they make contact with a potential client to ultimately converting a sale, and their understanding of how to measure that, how to track it. And that's where we bring a big advantage to the table. Often in these conversations, we utilize or highly recommend utilizing landing pages, custom created landing pages that gives us the ability to obviously direct the message back to, or the content on the landing page back to the message, so there's a direct correlation to what the user's looking for, but then the ability to track the lead channel even further with form fill, calls, clicks, etc. The struggle is the SMBs often wrestle with why they need to do that, why they need to put additional funding into separate landing pages when they've already got a website. But as we all know, those websites are not designed for conversion. Often they're not even that well designed for delivering the appropriate content and functionality, but the more we can streamline that process and get the right information from the consumer through a landing page, the more beneficial indeed it is.
I think generally, most of us on the phone need to do a really good job of setting clear expectations for our clients because almost all of them are thinking about lead generation when they're talking to media providers that provide really any sort of media, whether it's a display ad campaign all the way through a search engine marketing campaign. At the end of the day, they revert immediately back to calls and sales. That's what they're looking to get to. And if you're looking to take Facebook campaigns and display campaigns and other things that provide immense value to a campaign but don't necessarily generate strong volumes of calls, you're going to be fighting through renewal on those campaigns with every single customer. Our recommendation and what we've seen be very successful is making sure up front the customer knows what to expect, what the key metrics should be, especially if it's not calls, and that they understand how impressions benefit their business, and ultimately how we're going to measure success at the end of the campaign. And every single call, again, we get onto, we reiterate what those metrics were that we agreed to when we launched the campaign and how we're doing against those metrics. And as we do that, again, we're seeing more and more success and less attrition along the way.
So one of the places that we spend a lot of time and we think we bring a lot of value is understanding the SMB goals versus pain points, and how do we address that in a manner in advertising and the results of the advertising that makes a difference for these SMBs. Ultimately, how can we be successful on their behalf? So if you look at their goals, we've sort of put a summary together here. We're trying to bring new consumers to their office, place of business to increase sales. We're trying to drive as many leads as we can at the smallest cost per lead. There's a trade-off here of quality versus quantity that we struggle with, and that, quite frankly, they struggle with. Ultimately, trying to deliver the highest ROI possible. At least in the verticals that we work in or work consistently in, there's a higher interest in calls and clicks in some verticals, certainly in retail. There's also a high interest in store visits, but at the end of the day, clicks aren't as meaningful as further down the stream of conversion. Most of these guys are looking for a Lexus on a tourist budget. They're looking and have the general understanding they should be able to drive digital leads at a much lower cost than other media, whether that's right or wrong. They tend to put a heavier focus on selling their high-value products and services. That's not always a competitive advantage, but they're certainly trying to push, the 20% of the product that drives 80% of their margin, and we understand that. We try to work through that, help find ways to remain competitive in that environment. And of course, bringing this full circle to the first slide we presented, they want to appear first on Google no matter what. Logic doesn't matter, understanding somewhat doesn't matter, they still want to be first on Google. And as we all know, there's benefit to that. So how do we match that up against pain points? Budgets tied up. Often these guys have budgets tied up. The SMBs have budgets tied up in other marketing ventures. They have bought mass media. They have billboards. They have whatever it may be that in an effort to promote their local business. So we have to fight through budget issues and allocations of budgets. They typically struggle to keep up with digital marketing as a whole. Heck, the people on this call are struggling to keep up with the changes in digital advertising arena on a day in and day out basis. However, these guys struggle with that. That brings some hesitation and pain. Often we see a reluctance to change. Many of these guys are traditional businessmen that have been in business for a period of time, have had success, and now are confronted with needing to change because the marketing environment is changing around them, and they're still reluctant to do that. If they're successful, that's even a little more understandable because they're still driving success through traditional models. Digital is hard, expensive, and tough to track. We've been talking about that. Certainly a need for more educational model or materials. As an industry, we need to do a better job of making this as simple as possible for these guys, and in many cases we have failed to this point. I think it's getting better. There's never been a type of advertising where you could do more self-study and more self-learning. However, that takes time, and these guys typically don't have time. And then they want to be able to deliver as fast as possible when consumers are searching online. So certainly getting into that buying funnel and understanding how to drive success, those are the things that we address on a day in and day out basis or are confronted with by these SMBs. So their wants and needs from a third party are those overlapping factors between goals and pain points, and where we try to focus on, and I would assume the majority of the folks on the line are trying to focus on delivering on behalf of the SMBs.
Okay, so thanks again, Gary and Chris, for conducting today's webinar, and thanks to everyone for attending. If you have any further questions or would like to be connected with today's speakers, simply email us at webinars@thelsa.org. Also, for a look at what's coming and to access all of our past webinars, visit www.thelsa.org/webinars. So thanks again, everyone, and have a great day.